especially toward Europe and China, how will it be different from Trump's first term? And also, some people said that the United States will adopt its foreign policy purely from a China prism. So do you agree with that?
From what? From it?
China prism.
Okay.
Yeah, China prism. So, and how do you foresee that Trump's foreign policy will affect Europe-China relations? So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good afternoon to everybody in Brussels. My name is Sourabh Gupta. I'm speaking here from Washington, D.C. Good afternoon to you, Mr. Yang, and thank you for organizing the event. This is a fascinating discussion because folks don't usually study the trilateral dynamic of US, EU, and China relations. So it's always interesting to talk about this issue. I have some prepared initial remarks which I want to touch upon, but I will fold in what you had asked within my initial remarks, and I will straight away, in terms of your initial question as to what has been the reception of the U.S. election, and just what exactly did the U.S. electorate say. I think the important takeaway out there is that it was initially thought that it was going to be a neck and neck race. It was going to be very close, and therefore it would all come down to the battleground states. There were just about 5 or 7 states, and typically that it would come down to blue-collar, non-college educated workers in terms of their preferences. They had been the decisive weight which had shifted the election for Mr. Trump in 2016 against Hillary Clinton, and in 2020 in favor of Mr. Biden, so that they would be again a very sought after cohort group in this election. And of course, that also immigration would play in, particularly when in some of those battleground states such as Arizona, which is a border state. The fact of the matter is that this election was unlike most other US elections. If there is a parallel to any one election, I would say you have to go more than 30 years back when Bill Clinton defeated George H.W. Bush. And he said that, oh, it's the economy, stupid. That was what he ran on. And that is effectively what was the case this time around. It was not about a particular cohort group, say Latinos or Black men or union blue-collar workers. I think this basically cut right across. It was a cross-cutting phenomena where it was high inflation, high interest rates, and cost of living, which really took a toll on initially Mr. Biden and then Ms. Harris. And in a way, this is not very different from what happened in Japan, where Mr. Kishida was voted out. In the conservatives in the United Kingdom, though they had run out of steam out there. So this is a phenomenon which is not unique, and that I think is what the voters said. And therefore, one really cannot gauge too much whether it was a particular small dynamic which kind of shifted the race, or there was something much more major. And I think this was just about the economy altogether and the cost of living crisis, which just wore people down. And despite the fact that Mr. Biden had made important investments in US manufacturing, industrial policy, which was beginning to create jobs, that was nowhere near kind of overturning the sense of disquiet that was felt within the electorate, just purely in terms of that cost of living crisis. Of course, issues like immigration and all popped in at various battleground states, et cetera, et cetera. And so the story at the end of the day is, yes, Mr. Trump won, but it wasn't really, he won handily in the Electoral College and in the popular vote. But if one actually sees the numbers, Mr. Trump really didn't increase his vote share, the amount of votes he got from what he got in 2020. The reason the Democrats failed this year is because there was a huge drop-off in terms of what Ms. Harris won from what Mr. Biden won. There were almost, I think, 7 million votes less for Ms. Harris, while Trump just increased his tally by about 2 million votes. And Mr. Biden still had much more votes in 2020 than Mr. Trump had in 2024. So it's not a resounding verdict in favor of Mr. Trump as much as it is a vote against what the 4 years of the Democratic administration. Let me come down to some of my prepared remarks, and I'll take the questions later on. And in my prepared remarks, I just wanted to provide a table setter about who Mr. Trump is, because, of course, the focus has always been on him, and there's been a lot written about him. But I think we need to understand a few dimensions about Trump, and I'm speaking more from the trade and economic dimension, which impinges just as much on the Europeans as it does on China. And Mr. Trump has been called unpredictable. He is disruptive, of course, but he's called unpredictable, et cetera, et cetera. But on the trade and tariff issue, he's been utterly predictable for the last 30 years, maybe 40 years. Back in the 1980s, he was talking about, I'm going to slap a tariff on, if I was president, he was talking in the 80s, on Mercedes-Benz, and suddenly I'll see what good allies we have. He was talking the same language then as he is today. And so what is it that kind of animates and drives him? I think it's important to learn, because we now have evidence of how he dealt with these issues in the first term. Here's where Mr. Trump comes down fundamentally. His mindset is that if you are going to sell a good to the American consumer, good needs to be produced in America, and it needs to be made with American labor. That is his bottom line. That is the reason for his huge anger against China, because China runs a massive trade surplus. Basically, China produces at home with Chinese labor and then exports to the US, to the American consumer. He doesn't like that. That's the thing which gets him down. That's why he hates trade deficits. Now, the area where this kind of gets aggravated is vis-a-vis allies, because vis-a-vis allies, Japanese or the Germans, his view is they produce at home in their countries with their labor to the American consumer, and on top of that, we then defend them also. We provide our security guarantees, and therefore he has been so aggressive in asking, say, the Koreans to kind of jack up the support budget for the defense, for mutual defense. Or he's come after NATO saying, we need much larger, you folks need to bear larger share of the burden. That mentality, that's the fundamental underpinning of that mentality as to why he comes after NATO, he comes after his alliance partners in the Asia Pacific. For them, not only are they not producing their goods in America with American labor and sell to American consumers, but on top of that, they also are benefiting from US security guarantees, where the US kind of, in his mindset, kind of pays for their security, and therefore he wants them to pay more. And all of this was kind of driven right from the 1980s by Mr. Trump's mindset, anger and revulsion against the Japanese, that Japan was having these huge export surpluses. Then it was repatriating those surpluses back to Japan. Then it was using those funds to purchase Manhattan real estate at the expense of Mr. Trump's own business. And all this while the US was kind of guaranteeing the security of Japan. So that is where that mentality for Mr. Trump comes in, as to why he wants he goes against, or he wants to go against the Europeans because they're allies who don't bear their burden. No, I'm not justifying this. I'm just trying to explain his mentality. The second point we need to understand about Trump and his fetish and this thing with tariffs is, he talks at least that tariffs are a point of leverage, which then he will wave at his opponent and thereby get his opponent to get them to equalize and reduce their tariffs vis-a-vis America's. This has again been a mentality, but this mentality, I think, frankly, to be honest, should and can be challenged. And the reason why is because we saw what happened in his first term. And this is very relevant to the Europeans particularly, because Mr. Trump came against Europe and the EU and said, you have these huge surpluses, and I am going to waive these tariffs. One of his main points of anger was the US auto tariff is 2%, the European tariff is 10%. Europe runs a huge surplus in the auto sector. And so, the Europeans actually were wise on this, and they said, you know what? Why don't we have a kind of a mini free trade agreement with regard to industrial goods, wherein you remove all your industrial good tariffs, we remove all our industrial good tariffs. So, hey, you wanted to have leverage with by waving the tariff stick, you won, let's reduce all industrial tariffs. And at that point of time, suddenly it registered to the Americans that if they reduced all industrial tariffs, they'd still run a trade deficit with the European Union. And suddenly negotiations really didn't go much further than that, because at the end of the day, there's another animating factor for Mr. Trump and for his then USTR, who is slated to take an important role in this administration, and his name is Robert Lighthizer. Their mantra is that they want to have balanced trade. You sell to us, we sell to you, and it must be balanced. And it was not going to be balanced with the Europeans, because the Europeans had greater competitive prowess in many industrial goods. And so at that point of time, the negotiations collapsed, because Mr. Lighthizer came back and said, you know what, we need to include agricultural trade and agricultural goods also, so as to balance trade. And at that point of time, the Europeans do have certain protectionist reservations on agriculture, and the negotiations didn't go any further. The second danger I would alert the folks to, with regard to Trump using tariffs as leverage, and thereafter trying to bring trade barriers down, which he tried in his first term, is that there's a real danger here that, yes, you can get into a negotiation, but then what if that negotiation fails? What happens then? He will go ahead and impose those tariffs and say, if our negotiation succeeds, then I will remove those tariffs. But this is exactly what happened with China, vis-a-vis China in the during his first administration. They had Trump went ahead and imposed tariffs in the summer of 2018. There was very, very concerted negotiations which took place from December 2018 till May 2019. They came very close, with China making a lot of concessions, but they could not get it across the line. And once that negotiation failed, is when one can date literally not just the trade war being deepened between the US and and China, but also the beginning of the technology war between the US and China. Because on May 15th, the US made the decision to begin to go after trying to kneecap Huawei as the first step in trying to go against Chinese technological capability. And therefore, there's a real danger here that this business of trying to use tariffs as leverage actually backfire for all the parties involved, because when the negotiations thereafter are conducted, there can be things can go sideways, and things can be terrible. Let me just make one last point out here. But is given the fact that the US, that in Mr. Trump's view, he wants to produce at home using American labor to sell to the US consumer, there are obviously certain countries which are at risk out here. And this involves many of the US's allies and partners. I would list that, of course, as the EU, folks like the South Koreans, but most importantly, someone like Mexico, because a lot of investment, a lot of goods are routed to the US through the USMCA trade agreement, and that access door might get shut during this term. Mexico runs a huge the US, and there's a lot of European investment in Mexico. Apart from, of course, there's a good amount of investment in the US also. And therefore, but can this be an opportunity? And I'm thinking of China out here. During Trump's first term and Mr. Biden's term especially, there have been huge amount of tariffs and export controls. And and denoting China as a foreign adversary and Chinese entities as foreign entities of concern and being shut out of the US market. But for Mr. Trump, at the end of the day, as I said, goods, he wants foreigners to produce goods in the US with US labor and for US consumers. Why not China in EVs? Why not China in batteries storage systems rather than produce in China? Why not locate in the US? Mr. Trump doesn't care if it's the black cat or the white cat catching the mice. He wants those things produced in America. This could be an opportunity for China, even though the Republican Party is very anti-China oriented, but there's an opportunity for the Chinese to relocate some of their production in the US and be able to access the US consumer thereby. Because in the current scheme of things, Chinese goods, Chinese EVs, Chinese battery systems are more or less tried to be locked out of the US market. So can China use this as an opportunity? And can China get Mr. Trump to turn his Republican Party's mindset around in hosting Chinese investment? And there could be a win-win bargain to be had in this regard. And so we'll have to see how that works out going forward. But at this point of time, I think China has already been hit hard by Mr. Trump and by Mr. Biden. Europe faced a little of these considerations in the Trump first term. It managed to make a certain degree of progress in the Biden second term. In Biden's term, I think there was a lot more disappointment than success in Biden's term in EU-China relations. And we really have to see now going forward in Trump's final term when he has more authority. Remember, he owns Washington in a way. He's got the White House, he's got Congress, he's got a planned judiciary. And so he has just 2 years because after the midterms, he might lose seats. He'll become a little lame duck. This is his last term. I think he's going to be fairly aggressive in what he wants. And though a lot of the aggression is directed first at his own countrymen, I think there are folks like the Europeans, Western Europeans, the Mexicans, and some of his Asian allies who are probably going to have very difficult time dealing with Mr. Trump, just as China is going to have. But China already has come to term and learned how to deal with this sort of dynamic, while that part of the world hasn't. So we'll have to see how this goes forward. Let me stop right there. We can get to the questions thereafter, and so that others can also have their views put forth on the table. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gupta. And you just mentioned that actually Trump has a very, business or economic interest-focused agenda. So that's the bottom line of his mentality. So, but in the Europeans' minds, maybe security might be, more prevail than economic issues right now. So, Mr. Blankert, how do you think about, the U.S. policies and Trump toward Europe, and what that might intervene in Europe-China relations?
Thank you very much. By the way, I also wrote in 2009, then it was published, my book, China Rising, Will the West be able to cope? And I think that question is being answered day in, day out. Apparently the West is not able to cope. I mean, anyway, it is not so good what we're seeing. And by the way, wherever we stress it is Mr. Trump who introduced tariffs and who's going to introduce higher tariffs probably. Let's not forget that hardly any of Trump's very often controversial and provocative foreign policies were never, ever, as far as I know, reversed by Biden. He maintained all the tariffs, even increased some. He kept the American embassy in Jerusalem. I mean, there was hardly any measure, I think, where we really, what's the word, were perplexed in the West, also in enlightened circles in the US. How can he do this, Trump? And Biden didn't change anything. He just kept it all in place and propped it up in some cases. So let's my short answer to what will it bring Trump to is we don't know, because he's a very unpredictable man. I quote, and I very much agree to it, but I don't see it happen, Pascal Lamy, the former EU Trade Commissioner, and later the what is the Secretary General? Anyway, the boss of the World Trade Organization, who just last week, in an interview in the South China Morning Post, said that he foresees great problems with the arrival of Trump as the president of the US, and called him a threat to global trade, which is a very likely thing. But it's quite something, a former EU commissioner using that language. And he even says, Trump will pose problems not just to China, but to the EU and many other EU trading partners. And we should build within the WTO a united front against American protectionism. That's quite something. I don't see it happen. I would, up to a point, welcome it. When I was the EU China and Taiwan policy officer in the 2010 years, there was an optimistic mood. In 2003, I remember China published its first ever EU-China policy paper, a China-EU policy paper, where there was a great spirit of optimism from both sides, and from where the spring, I think 25, 28, you wrote about it, didn't you? Yeah, technical dialogues, cooperation, close cooperation, very serious cooperation in all sorts of things of food safety, transport, technical cooperation, nothing policy. And yeah, unfortunately, Mrs. von der Leyen doesn't find that sexy enough. And I think it's even no longer on the EU website where we had it in the past. But thank you very much that CEPS is now, is it still at CEPS?
And there's the EUI, European University Institute.
Okay, but anyway, and so it is still registered and noted, but the EU has, as far as I know, given up on it. It was such a, I would almost say sexy, but not sexy enough for Mrs. von der Leyen. Sexy, very good cooperation that brought many Chinese to Brussels. Regional policy, they came here once with I think 20 people to see how the EU, at least 15 years ago or so, how the EU did it. Well, it is one country where you would expect and where regional policy, such a big country, is very welcome. And then they come over to Brussels to look how we do it. But again, to get back to these words of Mr. Lamy, I think it's very important to keep it in mind. At the same time, with Mrs. von der Leyen and whatever, being her the boss, whoever becomes the, and yeah, yes, again, let's not forget how many, Trump may even top it up more, 60% tariffs over there. It would be very sad if the EU would follow it. Let's not forget, the US has a very serious overall trade deficit, which is more their internal problem, but they blame China for it. And the EU doesn't. All the EU's blah, blah about having a trade deficit. Yes, of course they have. But for instance, the Netherlands has a very big trade deficit with China, but they earn a lot on repackaging, processing all the stuff they get from China and getting it through to the rest of the EU. There was also a long time ago a study by the Dutch Central Planning Office, but actually rather the Economic Forecasting Office, which you could almost read as a thank you China, where there was, I think, 35,000 jobs could be ascribed, could be assigned to the imports from China, where people then had jobs to process it and transfer it further on to Germany and other countries in the EU. As one of the issues where also Biden simply copied Trump was one China policy, although he, in the very beginning, his very first day, his inauguration, he invited the representative, and as former Taiwan expert, I am aware that every word matters in the EU, or in the Taiwan China relationship. He invited the representative of Taipei, of Taiwan, to his inauguration, which is absolutely against the one China policy, no high political level context. But anyway, so it is, I mean, all this Trump. I mean, if Biden copies it, sorry, then it is apparently American. Well, I think there's a lot to say, but let's first listen to your questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Blankert. So
what answer your question?
Okay, yeah.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think I learned a lot from your what you said. And also you emphasized that Trump is very unpredictable. And
yeah.
And also, but I think what you suggest is that there's some, how to say, the EU-China relationship has its own logic, so that it might not be affected by Trump presidency. So
could be.
Yeah. So let's turn to Mr. Cui, who just arrived in our meeting room. And how do you think about, Mr. Trump's the upcoming Trump presidency's China policy, and how do you evaluate China-Europe relationship right now, both currently or in the long run, and what U.S. policies might play into this important bilateral relationship?
So, firstly, thank you so much for this opportunity. But of course, I'm so sorry I'm too late. So hopefully I will not miss some important thing. Indeed, firstly, I try to find out the kind of Chinese way to find out some similarity or even commonality between China and Europe to deal with this so-called comeback, or we call the second version of the Mr. Trump. I think, firstly, politically, I think for China and Europe, I think we do have this similar understanding of the situation, why Mr. Trump could go back to the White House. You know, I think 8 years ago, during his first term, perhaps for China and Europe, we do have some maybe imagination. Okay, it's just a very, very specific situation for American politics. Perhaps when we went to the Biden administration, which means that, okay, go back to the normal for American politics. But I think the comeback of Mr. Trump to White House means that maybe there is a new normal, I mean, for the American politics. Of course, the politics is not our concern, but as a consequences of political change, certainly the long-term logic, especially for the policies, would be the focus for us, especially for our discussion today. I think maybe two very, very important dimensions for this, I think the policy logic for a Trump administration. Firstly, as we discussed before, is a kind of anti-globalization or anti-liberalism mindset. Indeed, if we look at this so-called tariffs against not only China and also European Union, certainly very, very remarkable index for this anti-liberalism trade or some other. Another, I think, dimension is isolationism, foreign policy, diplomacy, or some other. Especially, I understand for our European colleagues, very big worry or suspicion about maybe huge change or up and down change for its Ukrainian crisis or Ukrainian, position. It's recently we can find out more and more diplomatic gaming between these major stakeholders, United States, Russia, Ukraine, and even European Union, NATO, some other. So if we find that, yes, these are two very, very remarkable, or maybe for a long time, a stable policy logic for Trump administration. So we can find that, yes, what we should do, what we could do for this new normal of American policy towards its, not only its rival like China and even its ally like European countries. I think firstly, we need to know that how could we deal with this a little bit more difficult situation, not only for Europe and also for China. Is it looks like a Trump administration, it has some more instrument to deal with its relations with European country, with China, by a kind of I think a mixture of instrument, not only trade instrument and also security instrument. I think it will give more difficult situation for European countries to deal with any challenges for this transatlantic relations than this situation, 8 years ago. Because even at that time, even there is a Crimea, but still, I think there was not so big difference or problems between Europe and the United States on security issue. But this time, undoubtedly, now most of the European countries, you have to try to get some more so-called security protection from the United States. It could be, I think, weaponization for Trump to do something. Especially, I think maybe there is a kind of a negotiation tactic for Trump. Say that, okay, please meet my demand for tariffs. Otherwise, I will give some surprise or give some big shock on this security or some other issue. I think for China, yes, we also need to deal with a new situation is comparing with the Biden administration, maybe more uncertainties or a kind of a new steps or very different reasons will be in the position. I think China need to prepare firstly how to deal with so-called higher than the 60% tariffs against especially some sectors like telecom, like some other, including some technological restrictions, like chips or some other. I think China is trying, doing something to deal with this situation. But indeed, no matter how could we do something respectively, Europe could do some preparation for the 10% to 20% tariffs, perhaps from Washington. And China could do similar preparation or some other. But undoubtedly, a kind of more engagement or more coordination between China and Europe on this regard, I think it could be very, very important. In China, we have a very, very important historic lessons from our own history. In China, we do have a kind of multipolar world-like period in the history. We call it 战国, called the war period, war state period. At that time, there is a hegemony, like a Qing. And there are some other smaller countries or powers. There was a gaming between the single superpower and some smaller powers. And of course, finally, the superpower, Qing, conquered all of these smaller powers and become a single, center for the world. I think a big lesson for these smaller powers is they have to deal with any kind of pressures or some even how to say some tactics from the single superpower, and then one by one, China, European countries, some other, and then finally, if we just deal with it by ourselves, not by more coordination and even cooperation, finally we will fail. One by one, right? Yes, I think that there is a very, very big risk for the situation in that way. But of course, I think now, once we try to achieve some more coordination or even cooperation, we need to deal with some, current situation or current issues. Like, for example, we mentioned the e-waste issue. I heard from some officials in China who are in charge of this the ongoing negotiation with the European Union on the issue. I got some more optimistic messages from the officials. I think now from Chinese side, they are open to any kind of flexible solutions, including, yes, there will be a kind of promise from Chinese companies on the price of the e-waste to export to European market. At the same time, I think China now is very, very open for any kind of solution, including more green land investment from Chinese investors in European market, in European countries, especially for e-waste or some other green, economy. So I think now, no matter what happened for this so-called the name of anti-subsidy or some other, but I think on the technical level, both sides has common dynamic or waiting to deal with this issue smoothly. I think once something happens in that way, it will give a very, very important case for the further exchange or cooperation between China and Europe, because always we try to convince Chinese government or officials that we need to take every kind of change into your account, especially big change. When now European people look at China, it's very different from the past, from 40 years ago. So we need to take everything into consideration. We need to try to find a new type of the relations between China and Europe, especially in some areas like e-waste or some AI, some other. Perhaps we need to change the benefit model. China need to invest some more, not only capitals and also even technology, and we can try to get a new type of cooperation with our counterpart in Europe. But of course, it will take some more time, because not so easy for some policymakers or for some officials to really understand the requirement from realistic from reality from the situation. So maybe I could stop here, and I'm ready for any exchange and questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cui. And I think thank you for bringing us some optimism for the latest EU-China EV talks. And anyway, I think what you're suggesting is that maybe the other countries or the countries other than the United States have to be united together, to prevent Trump from going too further. But maybe I have a question toward Mr. Gupta. So do you think that many people believe that Trump is a transactional in nature, or a deal maker? So do you think that he will be much more a deal maker or he will use more coercive measures to other countries. So if he's a deal maker, so what kind of deals he would seek to strike with Europe and China respectively?
An interesting question. Yes, of course he is. He is a deal maker, and the purpose of talking just about tariffs and trade was because fundamentally that is the nucleus in his head around which his whole worldview rotates. And therefore, one of the obvious areas where I think he is going to try to resurrect will be that phase one arrangement with the US, that China and the US had in January 2020 with regard to managed amount of purchases, where the Chinese side would purchase certain targeted quantities of US ag goods and natural gas and all those things. And he's going to come back with that because in his view, it was both a great deal, number one. Second, initially at least, he says the Chinese were meeting their targets. All that fell off though as COVID became more deeper. And so for him, as a not just as a deal maker, but as a mercantilist, where he doesn't want to import or he wants to have a balanced trade, but he wants to export, he is going to go after China in that regard and try to get China to do managed purchases of US goods. And that's why I got the point out that maybe China should preempt that by saying, we will bring managed amount of Chinese investment in the US, but you need to tell your Republican colleagues that they need to be welcoming and they need to protect Chinese investments in the US. And we will create American jobs and we'll sell to the American consumer by being in the US and not from China or via Vietnam or via Mexico. Well, Europe, the question is just that much harder for me. You know, Europe kind of told Trump to its face in the first administration, you want to cut tariffs? You want to equalize tariffs? We'll equalize them. Let's do it. Not all non-industrial, all non-agricultural tariffs. And Trump realized, oh, I cannot do because I'm going to come out as the loser out here. And so one of the areas where again he is going to come aggressively, and the US and I assume the EU will be receptive, will be in terms of purchasing huge amounts of natural gas from the US. That was also part of the bargain administration. I'm sure he's again trying to jack up shale gas production to the high heavens. So this is an opportunity for the EU to kind of lock in long-term natural gas contracts with China, depending on prices, of course, especially given that the Russian production, Russian natural gas sales, EU still depends up to a point on that, but I assume would not like to depend much further on Russia on this front if it can. There's a question out here because Trump also wants to cut down on regulations completely. I mean, regulations, and that includes kind of environmental regulations with regard to shale gas extraction, with things like methane emissions, et cetera, et cetera. And so the EU will have a little difficult question to handle in this regard, whether it is willing to purchase kind of environmentally damaging shale gas production with high methane emissions, even though that is a bargain it can kind of make Trump happy with. So that's one area where I see the EU potentially working with Trump and to its own interest out there. I don't expect much progress, as I said, on industrial goods or on tariffs. And in fact, you know, he has talked about doing an across the board 10 or 20% additional tariff. And he has the authority basically to do so. Unfortunately, the way the system works out here is it's difficult to bring tariffs down. The president has difficulty in getting tariffs down, needs congressional permission on that. But if he wants to ratchet tariffs up, he has all sorts of authorities that he can rely on and do that. And this is going to become a difficult question, not just in terms of trade, because this will roil currency markets and those sort of issues. And so there needs to be better macroeconomic management also and global coordination in this regard. we'll have to see who is nominated as Treasury Secretary, because that person will be the point person for Europe to kind of smoothen out these global macroeconomic ructions, which are inevitably going to come because of Mr. Trump. And ultimately, I think on the security front, there's nothing happy to tell the Europeans except that he is going to come. As I said, for him, he finds it to be treasonous that the United States runs a deficit with Europe and then also provides security guarantees out there. And so the question of ramping up autonomous EU security capabilities, I think, is absolutely essential. We'll have to see if Europe can actually do the requisite thing that on that front, because Europe also has its own debt issues and its own political issues. One other area where I think there might be an opening, I don't know whether Europeans come down on this issue. I think there might be a little bit of again, we're talking in terms of energy policy. There might be, the US is going towards, nuclear, relying again to some greater extent on nuclear energy. Whether that opens up an area for cooperation with Europe, I don't know, because, there are folks like France which get tons of this thing on nuclear energy, but there's a lot of kind of concerns in Europe on nuclear energy, but maybe some of the Central European countries might be more open to that. I've seen the South Koreans selling nuclear reactors in the Czech Republic, competing against others. So I don't know if this is an area. One needs to try to find win-win bargains which benefit Europe in the trade and economic area just as much as the US. Nuclear could be, natural gas could be, and try to minimize the area where the frictions will be. And that's why it's important to maintain macroeconomic coordination. But the Europeans need to also, be ready to use their many instruments that they have, their anti-coercion instrument and their other instruments that they have, many of which, the first term with Ms. von der Leyen, one of the real advances that the Europeans made was they really appropriated a lot of foreign subsidies regime, and the procurement instrument and anti-coercion instrument, et cetera, et cetera. And some of these might need to be levered against the United States. Some of much of the thinking was that this was going to be utilized against China to get it to level its playing field and work on different terms. But the Europeans have to be ready and willing to deploy these instruments against the US. And I think given Europe's heft, it's just as big a part, an economic entity as China is. Both countries need to use that toolkit and be ready to use that toolkit a little bit more liberally, or threaten it a little bit more liberally against the US. And so it's about sticks and carrots, and we'll see where all parties come down in this regard.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gupta. And maybe I can now turn to Mr. Blankert about, the previous speakers, including yourself, has put forward a lot of pressures that Trump might impose on Europe as well as on China. So how, because we are seeing a new EU team is also taking office very soon, and also there are a lot of political changes now happening in the continent. So under such circumstances, how do you see that Europe will respond or react to Trump's pressure? And there are some opposing views that Europe might choose to stand together with China, as maybe Professor Trey suggested that everybody's united against Trump. No, to be more aligned with China. But the opposing view is that Europe has to to play China card to seek or to please Trump and to seek compromises from him. So do you think which way will Europe take?
That's a good question. But as I put it already, with this Mrs. von der Leyen, a very strong hand, and what would say anyway, an overruling boss, and fairly hostile anti-China attitude. I mean, I never forget my almost shock last year, April, just before they went off to China, with horrible language in it and outright threats towards China. If we will really watch what China's doing on the Ukraine, Russia-Ukraine war, the war in Ukraine, and our relationship with China will very much depend on how they behave. I mean, would China ever tell the European Union, the way you behave in Gaza will determine how we look at you? No, it's our business, and how China looks at Ukraine, unless they directly get involved in the fighting, is China's business and not the EU. Your question was, I don't see immediately in this commission a real opening of the EU to China, as Mr. Pascal Lamy calls for. But maybe circumstances will force us, but I don't see that coming very soon. Yeah, I could elaborate for half an hour on it, but let me keep it short. And maybe we ask the audience also.
Okay. So, Ms. Cui, how do you think about this, prospect? Will, Europe more likely to keep balance in this U.S.-China rivalry, or it will be more, how to say, aligned with the United States?
Yes, I think it would be very important question for China how to deal with this more complicated situation in between China-US relations, China-Europe relations, and even transatlantic relations. Of course, if we take Russia into account, maybe there is a China-Russia relation, all of the very complicated situation. But I would like to say, certainly China is trying to, get some closer, exchange and cooperation with European side. Because to a large degree, I think China shared a lot of same feeling we need to deal with. So just like I mentioned, this anti-globalization tendencies represented by Mr. Trump and some other politicians. And even China tried to have some more, contributions to the international community in the name of taking more responsibilities from others. So we can find that the tendency of the Chinese policy is very different, maybe in a different direction with Trump administration. Certainly, even now we are more and more we have more and more suspicion on this liberalism and free trade or some other. At least I think China still try to get some more opportunity to cooperate with the European side to see that okay, we still try to push forward this free trade or a kind of multilateralism or some other. But of course, I think now the big question is also in the past several years, we do have problem. I think between China and Europe, lack of or less and less mutual trust. Just like gentleman mentioned, President von der Leyen and the last European Union institution, some policy towards China, including de-risking or economic security or reduce dependency on Chinese market, all of this. So I think it gives a very, very now big problem for how to both sides to find out the way to reconstruct the mutual trust. I think it's a very, very big question now. According to my understanding, that the precondition for European side to have this more mutual trust with China is the European side should have some more confidence about yourself. I think it should be the confidence building before the trust building. Still, I think, frankly, from a Chinese understanding as a scholar, China still takes advantage of its cooperation with Europe, even on this EV, or some green economy issue. China still understands that the European side has some advantages. Even we can achieve a kind of a complementary cooperation. It's not a kind of a competition, pure competition. No. But now the question for both of us is, if we are wise enough to get maybe kind of a new type of a cooperation, take some more and more competition into account, because it's very different from past. In the past, the complementary cooperation between China and Europe means that European side take more advantages, technological, capital, some other. But now maybe China has some its own advantages. So how could we find a new type of cooperation between two major economic power? I think that could be a new question and also important issue need to get answer from both sides. Another is, I think that the European side should have very clear mindset to any kind of tactics from Washington. Just like I mentioned that perhaps there will be some very big attraction once European side thinks that, okay, I can get some deal with Washington and to avoid any tariffs from Washington to me, and I can transfer the major problem between Brussels and Washington to China. Just like what happened during the first administration for Trump on this issue of steel and aluminum tariffs. At that time, there is a common consent for both Europe and the United States is overcapacity. Now here is still overcapacity issue between EU and the United States on the EVs or some other. So I think now the very, very important thing is between China, Europe, and the United States, we need to try to avoid any kind of, I think, a risky situation is any two sides to get to work together to deal with another third party. When something happens that way, I think it could be in the interest of Mr. Trump. Because anyway, frankly speaking, the United States still the single superpower. It could take some more instruments than both China and Europe. We have another very historic lessons in China. Is as we know, we have the Three Kingdoms. So now, like the situation, a little bit like the situation, the historical situation is, once there's a more cooperation or exchange, dialogue between China and Europe, it could give some more contribution to a more stable structure, not only in the geopolitical and also in the geoeconomic situation in the future. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cui. And so you used a lot of historical experiences of China to how to say to shed some light on on how Europe and China could deal with each other, and you also stressed that confidence is very important for Europe, to maybe to keep some balance, and to maybe to help it stand up, on this, in this EU US-China strategic rivalry. So now I think we have like maybe 20 minutes left, so that we can open the floor to the questions first, maybe inside the meeting room, and then from the online. I've already seen some questions from online, so that maybe in this room first. And Mr. Geiser, and then Mr. Wolfgang.
Both guys, I'm one of the guys in the House of European History. A question for the space speakers. Do you remember Mr. Trump saying, when I will be president, I will stop the war in Ukraine within 24 hours? Do you think he will try to get the help of China in order to achieve this ambitious goal?
So your question is for all the speakers?
All speakers.
Yeah, maybe Mr. Blankert first.
My answer is, I don't think so. He doesn't need China first. But if he would, that would be interesting.
Okay, very interesting question. So far, I don't think China get any message from Mr. Trump to provide assistance. I think if we try to find some messages from Mr. Trump's attitude or promise to his voters, that okay, I can do something as quickly as possible. Personally, I don't know how, indeed, because as we know, it is in his style to get some simple, quick response to any kind of requirement from people. Of course, I don't think we can describe it as a populist, but indeed, it's a populist style response. And I think now Mr. Trump will do something if he wants to do is maybe to get some exchange with President Putin and to take use a kind of maybe we don't know on-land relations between those two leaders, and then find out a solution between United States and America, and put it on the table in front of Ukraine and the European countries. Say, okay, they just say yes or no. I think on this regard, frankly, I would like to try to give some suggestion to Chinese government that how could China do something, right? I think firstly, China need to get some more close exchange with European countries. Because when something happens in that way, I mean, a kind of a compromise between Washington and Moscow, and then ask other stakeholders just to follow it. I think it's out of the interest of both of China and Europe. So I think now maybe a kind of a competition between this kind of a short or quick solutions by Trump and also a kind of maybe more constructive or more sustainable solutions, which could be reached by both China and Europe. I hope that there could be a kind of a situation.
Okay, thank you. So how about Mr. Gupta? Well, after Gupta answers this question, we will collect maybe 2 or 3 questions from the floor, and we let the speakers answer them together. So, okay, Mr. Gupta, it's your floor.
Yeah, the role that I see China could potentially play out here is just a facilitative role. So if Mr. Trump can bring Zelensky and the Ukrainians to the table, then China can use its good offices with Mr. Putin to come to the table and have that discussion. But I don't see China having any other role per se out here, and even a role with the Europeans. And I think there might be a little danger in China over-promising something to the Europeans, which it will not be able to deliver. So I think the role China would be, yes, we'll facilitate, but we facilitate if you can bring Zelensky to the table and try to wind the war down, then we can try to put a little bit, use our good offices with Mr. Putin. And I think one should take that lesson of what happened with regard to Kim Jong-un and on the Korean Peninsula, that when Trump reached out to Kim Jong-un, China used its role as a facilitator for the process and hoped that the best would come out from that, but did not engage directly in terms of trying to create a sort of an end state or an end game of what would happen. And I think that would probably be the best Chinese role going forward too.
Okay, thank you. So now we have maybe a few questions from the floor. Start with Mr. Wolfgang, and then Brian, and then Yang, and
Thank you very
yeah.
much for all 3 speakers, in particular that you don't put the West together as such, in contrast to the terms that was quoted here. As a European, I feel very much that we have a chance now with Trump and with China being open again to kind of find some kind of alternative to American policies. And I would say even the understanding of democracy in the Anglo-Saxon system. We Europeans are much more social democrats, if I may use the word, particularly the influence of Scandinavian countries onto the EU as well. And I see here a chance for the future to cooperate, as you said, Professor Ray, with China in particular. I would go into concrete examples, for instance, the tariffs on e-vehicles could be solved in a way that batteries, for instance, where it's a comparative advantage in trade issues on the Chinese side, could be balanced with the experience Europe has in producing cars as such. There might be a compromise, and we discussed it even in the same room with a group of young Chinese students at the time. I think there are lots of possibilities to cooperate. And with Trump, I think the Europeans becoming more aware of what you said, having more confidence in their own foreign policy. It's a fact. But the problem is, and there I'm a little bit critical, I was in China just 3 weeks ago, that many people in China see the EU and NATO as one bloc, one idea. And I think there could be a clear difference. if you look a little bit into history, you would understand that the Europeans were not so much in favor of the expansion of the NATO to the east. It's a historical fact. If you remember Genscher and Baker, two foreign ministers, transatlantic discussion at the time, it was opposed by the White House because there was a possibility even to bring Russia closer to the EU, if not becoming some kind of associate or member state of the EU at the time. So I think there's a chance now, I see it very positive, for cooperation between EU and China, in contrast to Washington in particular.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Wolfgang, for the comment. And now let's come to Brian, and then
I'm going to cheat a little bit. I have two small questions.
Okay.
So the first one is one of the big differences between Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0 is that now he has a co-president, and that co-president, Elon Musk, is insane. So we talked about how Trump is going to influence US, EU, China. How does the co-president influence that? What impact will he have? That's the first. My second one is that EU, we talk about EU as a coherent body as well, which it's not. It's got many cases. And we have two thorns on our side, Hungary and Slovakia, and they're friends of Trump. So how is Trump going to use Hungary and Slovakia to divide the EU on questions where we seek solidarity but can't get because of them? What's the impact of him possibly using Hungary and Slovakia to change the way the EU deals transatlantically, but also with China?
Okay, thank you. Now, yeah.
The first one is for Professor Cui, because he brings very optimistic message with regard to the EV negotiations. Could you give us more details? Do you think already the two sides achieve some kind of breakthrough or technical consensus, if that's the case? And second question is for all speakers. I mean, probably very complex, but what are the speakers' perspective of the future China relations under the Trump era? It's just probably difficult, but what's your evaluation? Would it be, are we going to be a little bit more towards the cooperation perspective, or more like competitors or rival?
Okay, thank you.
And your question refers to EU, US.
EV talks.
Just to,
But the second is.
China relations under Trump era.
Okay. We were supposed to have answered that already, but okay.
Okay, thank you. No, I don't know who. Yeah.
I have a question for Hongjian. It's great to see you in Brussels today. And I will be a bit provocative when no offense is meant intended. So, yeah, of course, you are not from the government, but because you are in Beijing, so you have probably more information. So I'm wondering if there is a way for China to respond positively to the allegation, yes or no, it's no market policies and practices in terms of subsidy, where this anti-subsidy investigation against the BEV is initiated. I ask this question because actually in the past couple of years, the EU has released quite a few legislation which are actually, in my view, lack of basis. For example, the procurement IPI has no legal basis. And the foreign subsidy regulation is unilateral because there are 5 more prohibited subsidies in there, also with this rebuttable presumption. So it's unilateral. And but I think what is that those subsidies at now I study subsidy. Subsidy is a valid policy tool as long as it doesn't cause market distortions. But because of this, so many subsidies at the central government level, at the provincial level. So in simple words, basically a European manufacturer competes with a state, a China state. Surely nobody could win against China as a state. So I think the concerns in Europe is real. But I'm just wondering that if China wants to positively respond to that, and on the price undertaking agreement, I'm not a negotiator, but based on my research, I think it's better not to be too optimistic, because for the past 4 years, not even one single price undertaking application was granted by the Commission. China or non-China, no. And now, last year, it's established in the court, European Court of Justice, that subsidy in third countries will be also applicable under the EU anti-subsidy trade defense instrument. And then the first part of this year, one Chinese undertaking granted in 2008 was revoked because of breach of confidence. So yeah, but in short, is there a way for China to respond positively to non-market policies and practices?
Okay, so I wrap up the questions. Okay, yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
From SEPS, Foreign Policy Unit. I would like to ask the role of Global South in the China-EU cooperation, hopefully. I really like to see the emphasis on that, but all the discussion was mostly about the European markets. But with the new tariffs and everything, the competition would like to shift to Africa, for example. Right, and we are expecting council conclusions in December, mid-December, most likely about global gateway to be used for open strategic autonomy instead of development. You know, how do we see global south in this region?
Yeah, thank you. I think your question is very important because global south is supposed to be maybe a new battleground for the Cold War or a new Cold War, or maybe global south could be benefit, from this rivalry. I think I summarize the questions. One is for Elon Musk, and I think 2 questions are EV negotiation related, and also I think the questions about Hungary and Slovakia, and also Global South. So that maybe I think the 3 speakers could answer these questions in turn. Maybe we start with Mr. Gupta. So you can pick up the questions addressed to you. Okay, thank you.
Let me make short answers to some of the questions. On the first discussion of functional cooperation, I think there's ample scope for EU-China functional cooperation. I listed out those 3 areas. One, of course, which we've talked a lot with, is the EVs. The bottom line, I think what China should embrace on the EV question, on the EV, this thing is, yes, this is a subsidies-related investigation, but the EU has also mentioned that what it is trying to do is create a certain industrial base that is sustainable into the future, because auto industry is just too important for the EU industry, for EU, and it cannot lose that industry. And therefore, I mean, the price undertakings must be done on the basis not just purely on how to clear the subsidy, but try to appreciate the fact that the EU wants to create an industrial base in this sector, in the EV sector, and on that basis try to frame the price undertaking. I think this is a win-win area because both sides want the negotiation to succeed, but it is a difficult one. But coming back to the issue of functional cooperation, 3 key areas: EVs, batteries, and green goods. Second is, I think, on data flows. China has liberalized its data flow regime in terms of having regulations, its most recent regulations. I think the EU and China have initiated a kind of a framework in which they can discuss. And just like the US and the EU have their privacy shield, and now it's called privacy framework, I think the time has come to strike up a framework for EU-China cross-border data flows. So that's the other area of cooperation, which I think is ready and good to go. On Elon Musk, what I would say is, I think China needs to be a little alert. I know it has good relations with Musk, but I don't think China, he could play the role of a valued intermediary, but might be able to play that role, but I'm not so sure about it. I think he's more like a unpredictable wild card in the administration. And so China should be a little, it can use Musk up to a point in terms of his relations with Trump, but it can be, we don't know where Musk himself stands in terms of within the administration's framework. And so one has to be a little cautious in engaging him. On non-market policies and subsidies, I think there's quite a lot of work at China's end to be done. I think we had the recent WTO trade policy review of China, and the Secretariat could not kind of nail down as to what are the extent of subsidies, and the character of those subsidies is changing. It used to be it's now transforming into those public-private guidance funds. How much money is going to be available? China also has these national projects in which it is probably government money in terms of procurement, but might favor Chinese private entities. We're seeing that in that private entity law that China is putting out. This can add a further layer of discrimination against Europeans. And so I think China needs to address this fact more wholly, because then what can be done is that China's accession to things like CPTPP can be enhanced to high quality standards. And thereafter, China can be part of that group trying to kind of bind not just China, but Asia and Europe in collective action areas where the two can obviously benefit, whether be it CBAM and environment, whether it's in other areas like trade, etc., and trade and investment policy. But I think there's work to be done at the Chinese end on this front, and I'm not very confident of how China is moving, the pace at which it is moving. Finally, on the global south, I think China is going to move aggressively in the global south. It already has done. I mean, I'd say wrapped up Africa. It's doing well in Latin America. But I think the lesson for China out here is that China needs to be just not a supplier of capital and investment and managerial know-how. At the end of the day, China needs to be a consumer of those goods which are produced. And to be able to do that, which are exported from Africa and Latin America, higher value goods, not just commodities. And until China begins to play that role, Africa and Latin America will be more dependent on EU and US markets. And Africans and Latin Americans, and also in Asians, the developing Asia, they want to move higher up the value chain ladder and then export their goods to China. So China needs to look at itself not just as a provider and supplier of this know-how and funds and capital and these projects, but also needs to become a consumer of many of these exports. And I think that will create a more virtuous cycle in terms of locking in China's relations with the world. So that's about what I have to say on these various questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gupta. Before I turn the floor to Mr. Blankert and Mr. Tui, I just remind that the meeting could be extended for a little while because we started a little late, so that if nobody objects, we will just we will have some more time of discussion. So now, Mr. Blankert, so it's your floor to answer the questions.
Yeah, the Global South, I forgot the figures, but I mean, in spite of all the sanctions and the disruptions in the trade between the EU and China and the EU and US, apparently there's already enormous trade flow, growing trade flow between both Russia but also China to the Global South, and we don't notice. We are completely looking at ourselves, but when you look at the figures, it's already more than half than our trade with China, something like it. Anyway, very high and rising numbers. EV speculation. If really China can learn a lot still from Europe in making cars. What I understand is the electric vehicles is a thriving market in China. Less and less the Chinese are interested in European brands where they always were very much interested in until 5 years ago, and definitely 10 years ago, because the Europeans don't come out with sophisticated enough models, and not with enough models. It's apparently the Chinese car makers come very fast with ever new models, which apparently Chinese consumers or drivers like. What was it again? Competition. Anyway, I understand that Chinese EV market is very competitive. That's what I read everywhere. So this whole subsidy thing, I don't know where it comes from. Oh yeah, I think that's pure speculation. Yeah, maybe there is indeed. The EU is not very united front that Pascal Lamy calls for. I think I see it less and less these days. I can make it a long half-hour answer, but I mean, Hungary has several times interrupted the word, interfered, frustrated. Like
the summit in Budapest was not successful, sort of cohesion. It was last.
Okay.
Presidency of Hungary.
True. Maybe we should keep them as a presidency.
Yeah.
Is the foreign policy a member state's competence?
Certainly 3 years. The summit nevertheless brought some kind of cohesion to the process, more than before.
Okay, thank you. Now, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we finished 3.
Yeah, thank you indeed for all of these comments and questions. I try to give some response, firstly to ladies, right? Because there's a question right for me. I think yes, I could not share some more details about the Chinese policy or attitude towards this kind of situation of the negotiation on e-waste amount. But I can get a very, very clear message is, if we look at this, the current solutions listed both by China and the European Union is a kind of a mixture. As we know, there had been a kind of a price compromise during it's not a trade war, but another trade friction between China and European Union 10 years ago. I mean, the solar panel, right? Mr. Duncan, you must know something more about that. So I think it's a part of the historic experience for both China and EU to deal with this kind of a trade friction. Another part is, okay, China should open the industry cooperation on e-waste or some other green economy. I think it's a new requirement from European side on China. I think it is in the reality that maybe on e-waste or some other green industry, China is taking its own advantage. Maybe just like I mentioned, we can find out a new model of our cooperation between China and Europe. Right, we can find out, yes, a mixture of solutions. Try to put requirement from both sides together, and then of course find the balance. So I think, according to my understanding, that the Chinese side is open to this kind of a mixture of a solution. Yes, we can take care of requirement from the European Union side that okay, we need to protect our market. Once there is a more and more import of Chinese e-waste to European market, perhaps there will be very big problem for our own, e-waste from other industry. Yes, maybe a kind of a balance of benefits there will be. Another, I think, for this cooperation in green economy or this industry cooperation, I think it could give us some new scenario for future. Say that not only maybe in the future in this area, maybe in some other areas, we can copy or we can learn the experience how could we deal with this issue? Because to some degree, maybe in near future, not only the EVs or the green economy, maybe in some other areas, China also will, get some more advantage than European Union. So in that direction, how could we find out maybe it's not just a case, it could be an example or model to deal with some more and more, issues like this. Another is market. I do believe that now China showed a lot of, confidence that it tried to also in the open, openly, widely, the recent the third prelim for the CCP, they account maybe more than 300 items of this some opening up policies or missions, and even for this market access or some other. Even we just talk about the issue. Several years ago we have the TAI, the comprehensive investment agreement between China and European Union, but unfortunately, it has been frozen or maybe it has been dead because of the sanctions between two sides. Now China is taking out of some items from the TAI to become a general measures or policy towards its policy of opening up in Somalia. So on this regard, we felt a little bit of pity. Once we signed and agreed this TAI several years ago, I don't think there will be so many or so big competitions between China and European countries. But we missed the opportunity, unfortunately. But now I think for China is, frankly, there is some big pressure on China now on its economic development or economic growth. Even I think for some Chinese officials, for some policymakers, they started to realize the situation is China. It's difficult for China just to take account of a GDP, which means a domestic product. Now it could be changed the mindset to the GNP, because China has a lot of interests outside, including trade, including investment, to some other. So on this regard, China has to. Maybe it's not willing from the government, but it has to do something more to take care of the global market and to continue its policy. If you are responsible for the country, for the state, for the people, you have to do something more to keep it open, not just like Mr. Trump or some other leaders did. Yes. Finally, yes. Global South. At the very beginning, I'm afraid that there will be some different understanding between China and Europe on this concept. For China thought itself as a member of Global South, or even maybe a kind of a representative of Global South. But maybe from a European or from American side, China is not the Global South. China another big power. But I don't think that it will not provide any possibility for both China and Europe to cooperate in the field of so-called Global South. For example, we always try to find out the connectivity between the Global Gateway project from the European Union and the Chinese BRI. Why not? Because if you look at the BRI and the Global Gateway, certainly the developing countries, Global South countries, are very, very important field. We need to get some more cooperation. Another one is, I think, now China, the BRICS and the G20, some global or some regional, mechanism. I think China could do something more. For example, to find out more connectivity between Europe and the global South countries. For example, in the frame of BRICS, I still remember the last BRICS summit in Brazil. The President Macron said, "Okay, I can go to a BRICS summit or some other." I think there are some opportunities indeed, and I think China could do something more to play a more, constructive role to help the, to find out even a kind of, I think, a trilateral cooperation, global South, China, and Europe. And finally, Slovakia and Hungary. Frankly, I do have a worry about the situation now between Europe and the United States once Trump go back. This 5 year, after the European Parliament election, and we can find that more and more far right-wing parties, they are not getting rise and rise. Now they are get into the government. They become a part of the ruling parties or coalitions of a government. I heard that there are already 6 member states of the European Union. They have a far right-wing party or some other. So it will become more easier for Mr. Trump to deal with the European issues or European Union issues. In the past, just like I mentioned, the first term of Trump administration, at that time, the European countries, member states of the European Union, they had more solidarity to deal with the pressure from Washington. But maybe it's not the same case now, because not only this relations between, there is another dividing line between transatlantic relations is there is a so-called far right-wing or populist parties and other mainstream parties in both United States and European countries. So once there are some willing from Mr. Trump to divide European Union, not only to take use, just like I mentioned, Hungary, Slovakia, and maybe he could have a call to Mr. Wilders, to Madame Le Pen. He said, "Oh, okay, please." So that will be, I think, a worse situation now. So I think that also why people say that it must be a wake-up call for European countries. Hopefully, it's not a nasty one. Okay.
Okay, thank you. I think for the sake of time, but maybe I still have some questions from online, but I will summarize them, and I will let each of the speakers to wrap up, maybe to say something about your brief takeaway from the meeting, and also in answer to Liang Ling's question. Second question is kind of I think I have some questions from online, but just in summarizing them, one of them is about actually the potential opportunities for Europe and China to cooperate. One of them is climate change. And another one is, which was not mentioned by the speakers previously. And another one is the processing of critical minerals. So should it be a opportunity for EU-China cooperation? And the second one is about, maybe this question has partly been answered by Mr. Cui about China's role in the international stage. Will Trump provide any chance for China to build up a relationship, or to enlarge its relationship in the world stage, So I think these are the two maybe main questions from the from online, and so I think I will let three speakers to answer these questions and also wrap up to speak about your major takeaway from this meeting, and also maybe if you have any suggestions to EU-China relations, maybe you can just speak it out. Thank you. So I was again start with Mr. Gupta.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yes. Yeah, absolutely correct. I mean, we've not dwelled on the climate change element. That's a huge area of opportunity, especially going forward, and especially because the Americans themselves are self-marginalizing themselves from that space going for years. Much of China's environmental legislation is kind of inspired by the EU, in fact. And I see China already working towards how it can accommodate itself on things like CBAM. Of course, China at this point of time is still uncomfortable with it, but it's already rolling out its own emissions trading scheme. And so this is an area of collective action where the EU and China can obviously work in concert. And just like they're doing on trade and investment, on data flows, and on climate change, I think those are the three main areas of deepening functional cooperation. And everything is kind of primed in a way. And China is moving faster than most developing countries is in trying to create this kind of framework for trading and emissions trading and for climate change mitigation. So I think it's a huge area of potential. On the minerals partnership, I just give a brief answer to that question in the box, but the point is, we're not sure where Trump is now on many industrial subsidies related schemes and in terms of trying to put other countries together in these sort of little bespoke frameworks like the critical minerals partnership. My view would be that, extracting critical minerals is not an easy process. And it's difficult, and the EU should go out and seek its own sources of critical minerals and also try to relocate some processing capability on its soil. But considering that China is so far ahead in the game in this area, the EU needs to see how it can work with China in terms of critical minerals processing. I think it's essential, and this can be folded into the larger issue of EU and China cooperating, doing trade and investment cooperation in clean energy goods. So that way, what was the third point that you raised?
Actually, it's whether China will be, provided opportunity by Trump
the
to
opportunity
relationship in the world. Yeah.
Yes, it will be provided the opportunity, but China has already moved out in a fairly significantly and aggressively over the last 10, 15 years, through the Belt and Road Initiative and the Global Development Initiative, and has made deep inroads into the Global South and has very, very good South-South relations with many, many countries in its neighborhood and, of course, in Africa and Latin America, and those will be deepened. And China will get a little bit more traction in European countries who are willing, who would have lent more if it had been a Harris presidency towards the US side, will be a little more willing reciprocators in terms of China. But China is already doing what it is doing. There are obvious limits also to what it can do and how high it can go, because it also depends on one's own action. One can talk oneself up, but also one's action needs to follow. And, there has been a lot of talk in China about liberalizing on trade and investment, doing this, doing that. I think delivery on the ground has not been as fast as would have been desired particularly by the Europeans on things like on subsidies and procurement and on that front. And so there's a danger of doing too much, talking oneself up a bit too much. But I think China is already making rapid strides internationally and is an anchor for multilateralism, and it should continue to be that way and support multilateralism. Things in ways like, the WTO, the appellate body doesn't work. So the Europeans and China are part of the multi-party interim arrangement on arbitration to do for dispute resolution. And in that sort of way, kind of lock in and champion multilateralism. Final wrap-up view. As I said, I'll come back to that same initial point. The nucleus of Trump's thinking is tariffs. Tariffs is then used to spin around his thinking about the rest, his whole worldview in terms of how US should cooperate and what the other countries can and cannot do in that regard. Now, there's no one kind of meeting point on tariffs because Trump is just off the charts in terms of what his ideas on tariff are. But it's important, given the strength of the US in the international system today and still the public goods that it does provide in the system today, to see where sort of win-win bargains can be worked with Trump to sort of kind of reduce the salience of some of his, reduce the danger of some of his actions. But obviously, the EU and China have a huge role in terms of cooperating with each other. And even if they don't cooperate as deeply, functionally cooperate, but even if they don't manage to find that depth of cooperation, they need to be ready, as I said, to use their own instruments, coercive instruments vis-a-vis the US and find common ground on that. And that itself can kind of stay the US's hand. US has already marginalized itself over the past 5-6 years in the international trade sphere through its tariff actions. And the US will come around to seeing, hopefully, that its own self-marginalization doesn't help in the longer run. And we just hope for the best going forward from there. That's the best I can say. And it does sound a bit pessimistic, I understand.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gupta, for your final thoughts. And now, Mr. Blankert, would you address some of the questions and also talk about your conclusion?
I like to remark about the comprehensive agreement on investment. That's indeed something that I should have mentioned, because I think there's at least perhaps finally now a chance. It was, of course, banned by the European Parliament, but if both sides lift their stupid sanctions and get to get it done, even if it's becoming more general, as you said, for more, so China policy, not typical for the EU. Let it be, but at least as far as there's still something special for the EU in it. Definitely. On climate change, we can say cooperation, but are we not already far behind China? I mean, when you look at that, we have to fight, the EU has to fight against cheap electric cars from China. Is there anything to cooperate? I found interesting that the Chinese industry or policy, you may know better, had said they're ready to invest in battery factories in the US if the US allows. Well, Trump being an opportunist and Elon Musk, I have no particular opinion, by the way, about Elon Musk's influences, but it could be. But I mean, two very unpredictable men, Trump and he. I don't want to speculate on that one. But definitely, the cooperate or benefit as the same way perhaps that China in the 2010s until 15 or something from EU knowledge and investment. Maybe it's now time for the EU to benefit from Chinese investment and knowledge. The climate change. I mean, China has more solar panel surface than the rest of the world combined. I mean, do we really have to teach China anything? That's and minerals is another. You mentioned the word. I mean, it's also an area where China is 20 years ahead of Europe. I mean, they have been investing in Africa in the 1980s already, with a view to electric cars. I mean, when Volkswagen and Dutch automakers in general still was shrugging their shoulders when it's electric cars, it's not for now. So maybe we lost it, and we have to simply to cooperate with China, but then it's rather us at the receiving end, perhaps. Let me leave it here.
Okay, thank you. And now, Mr. Cui.
Okay.
Yeah, we can just answer the question and wrap up your thoughts.
Okay, indeed. I think that now it's time for us to, I think, reconstruct the benefits, what we can achieve from this cooperation, not competition only. It will take some more time, just like I mentioned, that that's the reason why the EV's case is so important. It will give maybe a new model for China and Europe. How could we get along with each other, especially in some emerging areas or sectors? Yes, it's related to the climate change issue. So a kind of a ridiculous situation is we share a lot of common stands, commitment on the climate change issue on the global negotiation level. But once it goes to the industry, it becomes a more competitive. I think it's a very, very ridiculous situation. So I think this time, once we can find out a smooth, soft landing, a solution for this friction, certainly we can try to find out a strong support to this climate change cooperation, especially if we predict that Trump administration will shortly withdraw from Paris contract. If we will get another big, bit on this climate change governance efforts. So I think China and Europe, for us, is a very, very big pressure for us. Once we have some more friction, competition, or dispute on this green economy or some other, we have to deal with two very, very big risks. One is from Mr. Trump, another is from Russia. As you know, now Russia is try its best to convince China, say that, okay, you just buy some more oil and gas from me, and you can get a sustainable, stable energy supply from Russia, because Russia could transfer all of its export to European markets to China. There are some, very, very big mind on some new pipeline from Serbia or some other. But China has its own green transition goal or purpose. So now we always try to convince the Chinese government, please keep a balance between there are more maybe cheaper and sustainable energy supply from Russia, but of course it's traditional energy. It's not a new energy. At the same time, you do have your own purpose to support its climate change governance or some other. So I think it's time for China and Europe. We need to polish the common commitments and ground on this issue. Is yes, we still try to find a green transition as a single approach for us to promote not only the industry and also the life standard for the people. Secondly, we need to try to transfer this common efforts on commitment into the negotiation or any kind of compromise on this so-called green industry competition. So I think it's very, very important thing for us. Finally, for the minerals or some other, we need to, now the big question, not only for both China and Europe, and for maybe any kind of bilateral relations between major players, is because of some domestic politics or some other reasons, it's easier just to transfer the internal problems or challenges outwards to the relations with some other partner. Now the mineral issues or some other issues related to so-called supply chain security or value chain or industry chain security. It's a kind of, just like I mentioned, efforts of this transferring the domestic problems to outside. Always we try to help both two sides, China and Europe, to understand the situation. That the biggest wisdom for our past cooperation is we always try to lower down the tone on some difficult issues from a so-called political level to a technical level. But in recent years, the big question for us is, for both sides, I would like to say, they try to promote this technical issue up to a political issue or political level or even security level. As we know, once something becomes more political and security, it will give less and less space for compromise. So now it's time for us to test for both sides. How could we try to learn some experience for both of us to lower down those issues or considerations from so-called a political or security level to a more technical level. So actually now it's a very important case for the e-waste issue. If we could learn something from our successful experience for the past more than 4 decades.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cui. So now, because of the time, so I have to end the discussion. And maybe I will be very brief in summarizing the debate. I think, so very happy to have a very extended discussion with all of you. And also, but I don't think but time is still too short to answer all the questions. And I think this debate or this discussion, still, it produces even more questions. So, but I think this is itself is good, because this is the process of I think maybe mutual learning and understanding, and part of the process of confidence building. So that I think maybe the talks like this is a way to enhance understanding and manage differences. So that thank you very much, and thank for the speakers and all the participants, both here and online. And hopefully I will see you sometime again. Okay, thank you. Thank you all.